Before we begin, if you have ever prayed with everything you had and felt nothing come back, if you have ever stood at the edge of a loss so profound that the God you believed in seemed either absent or indifferent, if you have ever felt the specific, shattering loneliness of a faith that stopped working, and if you have ever been too afraid to say any of that out loud because it felt like betrayal, like weakness, like the kind of doubt that good people are not supposed to have this conversation was made specifically for you. And if nobody meets you in the real places, not the performed places, not the places you are supposed to be, but the places you actually are, subscribe right now. Because today, we are not going to tell you to simply believe harder. We are going to go somewhere far more honest than that, and far more useful. Let's begin. There is a grief that has no funeral, no ritual, no casseroles were brought to the door, no community gathered to acknowledge the loss, no language. In most of our churches, temples, and spiritual communities, is adequate to name what has happened. It is the grief of a faith that has collapsed, not drifted, not faded quietly with age or indifference, but collapsed, suddenly, violently, under the weight of a prayer that went unanswered, a tragedy that should not have happened, a silence from heaven so total and so prolonged that the entire architecture of belief that was built over a lifetime simply could no longer hold its own weight. And the person standing in the rubble of that collapsed faith is in one of the most spiritually and psychologically complex positions a human being can occupy, because they are not simply an unbeliever. An unbeliever has the comfort of a clear position. No, this person believed. They gave themselves to it. They organized their life around it. They trusted. And the trust, in some fundamental way that they are still trying to understand, was not honored in the way they expected. They are not faithless, they are faith-wounded. And Carl Jung, who spent his entire life at the precise intersection of psychology and spirituality, who wrestled his whole career with the question of what the soul actually needs, had more to say to this person than almost any theologian ever has, because Jung understood that the collapse of a certain kind of faith is not the end of the spiritual journey. Very often, it is where the real one begins. To understand why, we have to start with what Jung observed about the way most people construct their faith in the first place. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, the mask, the constructed face we present to the world and to ourselves. And he observed that just as we build a persona for our social life, a managed, curated version of ourselves that keeps us acceptable and safe, we also build a persona for our spiritual life, a faith persona. The faith persona is the version of belief we have assembled, largely unconsciously, from the materials our early environment provided, the theology we inherited before we were old enough to examine it, the image of God handed to us by parents, by institutions, by the particular tradition we were formed in, the prayers we were taught, the promises we were given, the deal, as it were, that we understood ourselves to have made with the divine. And for many people, perhaps most people who grow up inside a religious tradition, this faith persona is sincere. It is not fake. They genuinely believe, they genuinely pray, they genuinely live by it. But it is also, in a very specific Jungian sense, unconscious. It has never been genuinely examined. It has never been tested from the inside. It has been inhabited rather than chosen, inherited rather than earned. And then life happens. And life, as it always does, eventually delivers something that the faith persona cannot absorb. A child dies. A marriage ends. A prayer prayed for years with absolute sincerity produces no visible result. Justice fails to arrive for someone who deserved it. Evil thrives while goodness suffers. And the God of the faith persona, the God who was supposed to intervene, who was supposed to protect, who was supposed to honor the terms of the deal that was never explicitly negotiated, but felt absolutely real, that God does not show up in the way the persona required. And the persona collapses. Jung would say, this is not a disaster. This is an initiation. Because here is what the collapse of the faith persona makes possible, and what nothing else could have produced. The encounter with a God that is larger than your image of God. Jung was deeply interested in what he called the numinous, a term he borrowed from the theologian Rudolf Otto, describing the overwhelming, awe-inducing, sometimes terrifying quality of genuine encounter with the sacred. The numinous is not comfortable. It does not fit neatly into doctrinal categories. It does not behave according to the terms of the faith persona. In fact, Jung observed that genuine encounters with the numinous, with the sacred as it actually is, rather than as we have constructed it to be, are frequently experienced. At first, as destruction rather than revelation. Because the first thing the numinous does is demolish every image of the divine that is too small to contain it. This is what the mystics across every tradition have described as the night of the soul, not a period of faithlessness, not evidence of God's absence, but evidence of God's refusal to be contained in the vessel the ego has constructed. The Spanish mystic John of the Cross described it. The Jewish tradition has a word for it, hester panim, the hiding of the face. The Sufi tradition describes the annihilation of the self before union with the divine. And Carl Jung, coming to the same territory from the direction of depth psychology rather than theology, described it as the ego's necessary confrontation with the self, with a reality so much larger than the managed, controlled, persona-driven life that the only possible response, at first, is devastation. The disappointment with God, in other words, may not be evidence that God has failed you. It may be evidence that the image of God you were carrying has finally become too small for the journey you are on. But I want to be careful here, because I am aware that for some of you, this reframe your image of God was too small might feel like another way of spiritually bypassing the very real, very legitimate, very human experience of feeling betrayed, of feeling abandoned, of feeling that something you trusted with your deepest self did not hold you when you needed to be held. And Jung would not want that experience bypassed. Not for a moment. In fact, one of Jung's most radical contributions to the psychology of faith was his insistence that the full range of human emotional response to God, including anger, accusation, protest, and grief, is not a failure of faith. It is faith at its most honest. Jung was deeply drawn to the Book of Job, one of the oldest and most psychologically sophisticated texts in the human spiritual canon. And what he found in Job was not a model of patient, passive, quietly trusting faith. He found a man who argued with God, who demanded an accounting. He refused to accept his friend's theological explanations for his suffering, who brought his full, unfiltered, furious human reality directly into the presence of the divine and was, at the end of the story, declared more righteous than the friends who had defended God's honor with their tidy explanations. Jung wrote an entire work on this, Answer to Job, and his central insight was this: God, in the Jungian psychological sense, does not want your managed, persona-mediated, theologically correct response to suffering. God, or the self, the deepest layer of the psyche, wants your truth. Your rage, your grief, your accusation, your why. Where were you? I believed, and it cost me everything, and I need you to show me that this meant something. That is not faithlessness. That is the most intimate conversation a human soul can have with the divine. It is the prayer beneath the prayer, the one that strips away every performance and every formula and every inherited language and speaks from the actual interior, raw, unmanaged, real. And Jung would say, and the book of Job would say, that this is precisely the conversation that leads somewhere, because it is the first fully honest one. So how, practically and psychologically, does one begin to rebuild? Jung's answer was not a return to what you had before. The faith persona, once genuinely collapsed, cannot be simply reassembled, nor should it be. What was lost was not faith itself, it was a particular, limited, unconsciously constructed form of faith. And to simply rebuild that same form, to put the same image of God back in the same position it occupied before, and behave as though the collapse never happened, is what Jung would call a regression, a retreat to a previous stage of development to avoid the terrifying openness of genuine transformation. The path forward is not backward, it is through. The first movement is what Jung called making the unconscious conscious in this context. That means bringing into full awareness exactly what you believed, exactly what you expected, exactly what the implicit terms of your faith, persona's relationship with God, actually were. Not what you would have said in church, what you actually believed, in the deepest, most unexamined part of yourself. Did you believe that faith was a form of protection? Was that prayer a mechanism for influencing outcomes? That goodness would be rewarded and suffering reserved for those who deserved it? That God had a specific plan for your life that included certain outcomes you were counting on? None of these beliefs is shameful. They are human. They are almost universal, but they need to be seen clearly because, until they are, you cannot distinguish between the God who disappointed you and the image of God that was never quite large enough to be real. The second movement is grieving what was lost, not rushing past the loss toward reconstruction, not immediately reaching for a new theological framework to replace the one that broke, but genuinely mourning the innocence of the earlier faith, the comfort of the certainties, the particular relationship with the divine that felt so real and now feels so absent. That grief is sacred. It is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the soul's honest response to a real loss, and it deserves the same space, the same patience, the same compassionate witness that any genuine grief deserves. The third movement, and this is the most distinctly Jungian, is active engagement with the inner life. Jung believed that the divine did not communicate primarily through external events, but through the interior, through dreams, through symbols, through the movements of the unconscious. And he found that people in the aftermath of a faith collapse, who were willing to pay attention to their interior life rather than simply waiting for external confirmation of God's existence, began to encounter something. Not always the God of their previous theology. Sometimes something stranger, something more unsettling and more alive. Something that resisted the neat categories of their former doctrine and insisted on being met on its own terms. Something that Jung called the self and that he believed was indistinguishable, at the deepest level, from what the world's great traditions had always meant by the word God. The faith that is rebuilt after a genuine collapse is never the same as the faith that preceded it. It is quieter. It carries less certainty and more mystery. It is far less interested in being right and far more interested in being present to the complexity of life, to the reality of suffering, to the irreducible strangeness of being alive in a world that does not always make sense. It is a faith that has been tested from the inside, that has looked at the worst possibilities, the silence, the absence, the unanswered prayer, the tragedy that should not have happened, and found, not easy answers, but something more valuable. The capacity to remain, to keep seeking, to hold the question without requiring it to resolve on a human timetable. Jung wrote that the purpose of religion, genuine religion, at its best was not to provide answers. It was to provide a container large enough to hold the full weight of human experience without collapsing under it, large enough for the joy and the devastation, for the answered prayer and the unanswered one, for the presence of God and the silence of God, for the faith that is certain and the faith that is wounded, and the faith that is being slowly, painfully, courageously rebuilt from the ground up. That container rebuilt not from inherited certainty but from lived, tested, honestly suffered experience is not a smaller faith than the one that preceded the collapse. It is a larger one, a realer one that has been forged rather than simply received. And the God it reaches toward the God large enough to survive your honest accusation, spacious enough to hold your grief, real enough to be present even in the silence. That God is not the one you lost. That God is the one you have been moving toward all along. And the collapse, as devastating as it was, may have been the only door wide enough to walk through. If this met you where you actually are today, not where you are supposed to be, but where you actually are, then you know what nobody is here to do. Subscribe to Nobody. Join a community of people who are done pretending, done performing, and committed to the kind of honest, searching, courageous inner life that genuine faith has always required, and cheap religion has always discouraged. Every video we make is a companion for the real journey, not the one that looks good from the outside, but the one that is actually happening on the inside. Subscribe right now. Share this with someone who is standing in the rubble of something they once believed, because they need to know that the rubble is not the end of their story. It never is. Not for the ones who are willing to stay in the wreckage long enough to find what is still standing. The empire we are building is not built on the faith that was never tested. It is built on the faith that was broken all the way down and chose, with full knowledge of the cost, to begin again. Subscribe, and we will walk every step of that rebuilding together.